All right, so I think we can get started. First, I'd like to welcome our panelists as well as our audience, people who are coming from literally all over the world to join us today. I would say in Rome, but only two of us are located in Rome today. But I do like to welcome everybody to Eurogulf Information Center's third webinar in our series, Coping with Coronavirus. The idea, of course, is not only to discuss issues that are pertinent to understanding the world that's emerging from this crisis, but I think is also quite important for us to break the monotony of lockdown and try to engage with people and to talk to them and to learn more about their perspectives on what's happening. Today, we've chosen, I think, quite an important topic about disinformation, because you would expect that as the world faces a global challenge, one of the, the true global challenge, not a conflict, not a man-made disaster, but a challenge that is literally affecting the entire world, be it economically, socially, politically, in terms of security affairs. And you'd expect that people would come together at a time of great global challenge, but there's always a minority that are trying to exploit it and to gain for, into the future for when the situation is going to be more stable again. And one of the ways that I think one of the main issues that we've started to see during this coronavirus outbreak is that disinformation has been rife. Of course, disinformation campaigns have existed long before, but I think that now we're drawing more attention to it, simply because you wouldn't expect this kind of exploitative behavior to try to win hearts and minds or develop certain narratives on certain subjects. Now, today, we're not only going to be addressing the disinformation campaigns of related to coronavirus or related to political one-upmanship. We're going to be looking at disinformation as a practice. And so we've drawn together, I think, quite a unique panel. So I will just very briefly introduce our panelists. So, for example, here in Rome, from our partner organization, he seemed just to have disappeared. Well, hopefully by the time I get to him, he will have returned. But I can also introduce Martina Klemes. She's coming from the Stockholm International Water Institute in Sweden. We'll also be speaking to Mike Zinkanel from the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policies, one of our partners as well. Sulaiman Alwadai, I hope I pronounced it right, Alwadai, is from the International Institute for Iranian Studies. Rasanah, please.
It's all good. Alwadai.
Alwadai.
You pronounced it correctly. Don't worry.
Shukran. I'm trying so hard. Yeah, and so Sulaiman is coming from the International Institute for Iranian Studies, Rasanah, in Saudi Arabia. So each person is going to be able to make a contribution. Good. Alessandro is there. So Alessandro Politi is coming from the NATO Defense College Foundation here in Rome, and has been one of our core partners already for some time. So welcome to all of our panelists. And without further ado, well, actually, I'll lay down just one logistical point. So all the panelists will have a chance to give introductory remarks. Then I will give a set of questions to our panelists, and then we'll open up for public discussion, question and answer session. If you're interested in asking and posing a question, please make it as clear as possible, and please put it into the Q&A section on the bottom of the screen. Don't put it in the chat section. So without further ado, I would like to turn the floor over to Martina. Martina, please.
Hello, good morning. Greetings from Stockholm. First, I would like to say maybe you're wondering why a person from a water institute is talking about disinformation. So I would like to start with giving you a little bit a quick view why we in the water sector actually work and look into disinformation and information influence campaigns. You may know that 40% of global population is dependent on water, fresh water that's from rivers that cross borders of 2 or more countries. That's really a lot of people, and most of them, they lived in areas affected by conflicts. Many of them, it's in the Middle East, North Africa, different parts of Central Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia. And 60% of these rivers don't have any agreements. There are no agreements how this shared water is managed. Of course, we have international water law that gives some guidelines, but often this leads to disputes and disagreements. And we work, this is the realm of our work, this is what we do. And in the past few years, we've increased more information influence campaigns targeting this specific field. And that's why we started looking at this more closely. We also know that by 2050, we will have 3.9 billion people who will live in areas with extreme water stress. So water will become or is becoming a really important issue, a really important security issue. And that's why also we have now more of these information influence campaigns related to water resources. What we see is that there are different groups who want to control the narrative, who want to control why, for example, we have water scarcity. We see that they try to control why we have droughts, why we have water pollution in certain parts, why certain communities don't have access to water. So there is, we register increased impact of this. Sometimes it's also easier for governments to blame, for example, the impacts of climate change on the impacts on water scarcity, rather than admit that there are difficult issues on their part, that there is a need for improvement in internal water management. And that's why we started working with different governments and helping them with communication campaigns. We've also seen many non-state actors who resort to information influence campaigns. One of the most famous cases is when ISIS-Daesh used disinformation on causes of droughts in different Sunni communities in Iraq. When they were recruiting members, they would say that the reason why these farmers don't have water is because the government is deliberately cutting off their water resources. So they were really actively using the disinformation on impacts of climate change to recruit new members. And why is this happening? Why is this so easy? That is mainly because there is a lot of information uncertainty. And here we can draw a lot of parallels with the current COVID-19 situation. We have a very weak knowledge, very weak public knowledge about these challenges. We don't know, similar as with the growing water scarcity, we don't really know the future impacts of this. We don't also know the numbers of the demand. We have to put all together with the growing populations, changing economies, and all this in many parts of the world is very difficult to make accurate prediction. There are many different organizations who work on this and who really try to help these governments into having a better view of this. But in general, in the public space, there is a very little public knowledge about these challenges. And this is the same as with the COVID-19 virus. And this creates a lot of space for disinformation. This creates opportunities for different actors to take advantage of this situation. We also have a lot of asymmetrical access to information. Information is not equally distributed. If I give you examples from the water world, we often know when there will be a drought. We have early warning systems for droughts. But before this information reaches farmers in some of the really difficult and impoverished area, sometimes it doesn't reach them at all, and sometimes it reaches them too late when they can really not adopt any mitigating measures. So this is the same with this crisis, that the distribution of information about this is unequal. We also have, and that really now, let's think about the differences between the COVID-19 and then the wider impacts of climate change and water scarcity. In certain parts, we don't have decision makers who have who have actually low scientific literacy. So for them, it could be quite difficult to understand these complex technical solutions that are proposed by experts, and then back that with political will that would require adopt a lot of changes that will be extremely unpopular internally. Just think of countries when they have a lot of poor population dependent, for example, on rice, and then it will be difficult to bring across the message. You need to modernize your irrigation sources. You need to start growing different plants that need less water. So in the realm of climate change and water, this is very difficult. Now what we see is when something impacts public health, it is a little bit easier to adopt these measures. So, and why this disinformation, why does it spread so fast? We have because often we see that there is a lack of communication on behalf of governments, and then this creates a very easy ground for information spread by people we trust through communication sources like WhatsApp. We had instances in different parts of the world. I can use some from Iran, for example. We've heard that there were WhatsApp messages spread that if one gargles vinegar and rose water, that will cure the virus. There were many, many different types of disinformation on the cure, possible cure, and especially at the beginning of the spread, that people were taking it lightly, and then, yeah, there were many, many different possible domestic cures. And we also saw spikes of fake emails. There was a fake message allegedly written by Bill Gates that was being spread on the purpose, meaning what we should learn from the corona. And so what does this teach us? And then again, if we draw the parallels from the water world and the climate change, we really need to, we who work with these issues, we believe that supporting governments in the most effective parts of the world to work better with the communication campaigns and build communication resilience and understand why is it so important to be more open and to be really communicating about these challenges and to be reaching out to all parts of the society, also to the marginalized groups, and to really distribute information effectively. And I hope that we can draw these good lessons from the COVID-19 situation and bring it with us to the wider challenges like how we combat climate change and water scarcity. So I think I will end here, and then I'm happy to then address more issues during the questions and answers.
Well, thank you very much, Martina, for your introduction. It gives us a lot of food for thought. And as I said at the beginning, we'll come back. I will ask specific questions to you after we've gone through the round, but thank you so much. I will turn the floor now over to Alessandro Politi from the NATO Defense College Foundation to give his opening remarks.
Here we are. Thank you very much. I would like to start with a flashback. You know, when we talk about disinformation, one of the biggest campaigns that we have seen, you know, in our life quite recently was about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Evidently, other people and other countries, notably Russia, took good note. But Russia didn't invent that thing, didn't wait for that. They had a very, very long tradition since before the Cold War concerning disinformation. They have their own words, they had their own specialized sections, they had their routine, they had their experts. One of them was from the Czech Secret Service, of course, within the Warsaw Pact. So what happened after the Yeltsin period was that Putin, a KGBshnik, so somebody who knows very well the craft, took hand of, in his own hand, the government, and worked also on his own services. Some of them have been reformed, others are unreformed, like the GRU. So, business as usual, but with the advantage of social media. Now, social media, if you look carefully about what is happening, let's say now, you see that they are really the disinformation weapon of the poor. You know, when you have to make a global campaign on weapons of mass destruction, you have really to deploy a lot of resources. But here you see that it is just, you know, the capability to craft a simple message, difficult, I tell you, to dismantle, because it needs, you know, time to say this is not true, this is true, but it is the wrong context, this is, you know, okay, a possible innuendo, or it is, you know, a deduction, or it's just a supposition. It's easy to tweet something simple and misleading, and it's very difficult then to answer, you know, at length. Also because people like simple things. And so you see this campaign on the cheap that has, you know, been deployed during this time of crisis. It's evident that this campaign is much less intensive than influencing the US elections. But, you know, why we have to lose a good occasion? That's what they do in the Balkans. And I've been there for a whole year with a KFOR. And this is what exactly they do now in Western Europe. So one of the cases I would like to mention, because it's, you know, how can I say, charming, is about the Defender Europe 2020 exercise. It was fascinating to see the proliferation of strategic analysts, quote unquote, and of experts, quote unquote, that, you know, most of time told platitudes, telling that, you know, facts were so evident that they were self-connected without context, or just, you know, implying things without looking, you know, at even publicly available sources. So the exercise became, you know, the first thing that happened was, oh, the US soldiers arrive, and I heard also number not just 30,000, but even 300,000. I said, wow, that's a big NATO exercise. Saying, well, they are without masks. Oh God, they spread infection. Now, the other political thing was, oh, this is an aggressive move against Russia. We shouldn't make nervous Russia. Aggressive move. But they invaded, you know, Crimea and annexed Crimea in a totally legal way. They are just, you know, keeping unstable half of Ukraine, you know. It's a matter of fact. Well, you know, for these people and their quick relays, because the important thing is to have some relays, and then, you know, the WhatsApp chains will do the rest. Not even, you know, Facebook. It's one of the media. And so in the end, you know, the exercise was reduced for, you know, common sense. But I would like to remember that during the Cold War, we made exercises in a fully NBC scenario, nuclear, bacteriological, chemical scenario. So frankly, a flu should have been factored. Now, we understand that times are different, and probably the biological preparedness is not so good. But you see, we are far away from the scenarios of possible invasion, threat to Russia, and so on. You know, the world where we live, and surely, you know, our Russian counterparts are professional. And that is the problem with many of our politicians who are not professionals and who are not advised by professionals, and it shows. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. I will turn now to Sulaiman to give us the perspective from Saudi Arabia.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. Thank you to my colleagues and panelists.
Salam.
Thank you to everyone who is watching us and joining us through Zoom. My focus is on Iran, and I'm going to talk about Iran's disinformation campaigns during the COVID-19. And it's obvious, actually, that one of the global hardest hit by COVID-19 pandemic is Iran, and that Iranian regime is accused of covering up the outbreak. And for the sake of being objective, I will go through a series of facts about the spread of coronavirus in Iran, then come back to examine the disinformation campaigns advocated by the Iranian regime. So first of all, the Iranian regime only admitted that coronavirus had entered the country on February 19th. while reports indicate that the spread of the coronavirus started since late December of 2019 through January, February 2020. So we're talking about 7 to 8 weeks of denial. Then Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, first denied there is a problem and suggested that it is just a propaganda pushed by Iran's enemy who want to undermine the parliamentary elections coming up. Finally, President of the government Hassan Rouhani acknowledged there is a problem, but suggested that it's not serious enough, to require any quarantine measures. In fact, he encouraged people to go vote on the 21st of February parliamentary elections. Late February in a press conference, as we all have seen, government spokesperson addressing the nation claiming that the COVID-19 cases are overblown, while next to him, the country's health or deputy health minister, Iraj Hararchi, was sweaty and he couldn't even finish the press conference. One day later, this deputy of health minister was tested positive for coronavirus. So dozens of officials have been infected. A former ambassador to Syria and a senior advisor to the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, both had died. Then Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, with optimistic rhetoric, appeared again to say that he's not minimizing the issue, but asking people to not exacerbate it either, and saying that the country will recover in no time. But the fact that they have the deputy of health minister, the vice president, numbers of MPs, all infected with coronavirus, raises the people's concern and distrust of what the government is officially admitting and announcing. Some officials, as we said, have doubted the number, and a person only needs to look at the reports coming from cemeteries to know that the death toll is much higher than officially reported. Therefore, the accusation is justified that Tehran has been too slow to act. And I would say that the regime's efforts have been directed at controlling the information rather than bringing the contagion itself under control. Also, the lack of transparency has resulted in a catastrophic public health risk, not only for Iranian people, but also for Iran's regional neighboring countries in the region. And I have to emphasize here on the deliberate act of Iran that they did not stamp passports of nationals coming in and out from regional countries like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, and elsewhere. And as we know, all infections in those countries originated with the travelers coming from Iran. Therefore, Iran's deliberate and dishonest behavior delayed the ability of nearby states to take precautions and made it very difficult for them to trace the virus. Now, let's go to the forms of disinformation campaigns, let's say, or what the Iranian government has advocated for. I would say there are two forms or two major campaigns. One, claiming that the spread of the virus is just a propaganda pushed by Iran's enemies who seek to obstruct the turnout at the 40th anniversary of 1979 revolution, and also obstruct the turnout at parliamentary elections, which happened the 21st of February. Second campaign is suggesting that the virus, or actually claiming that the virus spread is a biological warfare. In March, the head of IRGC, which is Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps, Hossein Salami, claimed that the spread of COVID-19 in Iran might be due to a biological warfare. Then Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, in his annual speech on Nowruz, which is on the 22nd of March, accused the US of genetically engineered a biological warfare against his nation. And following Khamenei's lead, Iran's health ministry announced on March 23rd that scarcely available manpower and resources were being diverted to investigate whether the country had been subjected to a bio warfare. To sum up the introduction here, all those disinformation campaigns, and while the outbreak of the virus continues spreading in the country, the regime of Iran did not lock down Qom, the city of Qom, which was the center of the pandemic, and did not suspend the flights from and to China, did not require quarantine measures.
We may have had a technical glitch. We will wait a second longer for Sulaiman to come back to...
An Iranian interference, clearly.
Who knows? We'll wait a moment just for Sulaiman to be able to come back. If not, then we'll move to Michael, and then we'll come back when Sulaiman is back online. I think 5 seconds, and he will join us.
Okay.
4, 3, 2. So I mean, whether it's a live conversation or it's done over Zoom, there's always ups and downs to these things, and I think that our audience is also, you know, as patient as we are in trying to get. It's unfortunate that he was in mid-speech when it froze. For a minute, I thought it was my computer. But so why don't we push forward? Because I guess Sulaiman was just finishing up his introduction, anyways. So we'll move on to Michael now. And when Sulaiman joins us again, Michael, if you don't mind, I'll briefly interrupt you just to tell Sulaiman that we'll come back to him after you're done your intervention. All right. Okay. So please, Mike.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I would like to touch upon my research perspective that I am focusing on at the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy, which is specifically concerning disinformation, but also other forms of hybrid threats, such as cyber attacks. And I would just like to outline the European approaches, the European perspective, what the European Union has done in the past, but also, first of all, how the European Union is under threat by this new emerging means of spreading disinformation. So I would like to start with just a general definition, because probably we have missed that a little bit, what actually disinformation entails. The European Commission has said that it's verifiably false or misleading information that is created, presented, and disseminated intentionally to deceive the public and also to cause potential public harm to the people. So that means that the aim of disinformation, in a very general, broad term, is to distract, to divide the public, to plant seeds of doubt, and also to confuse the people, to weaken their faith in institutions and in established political processes. So having said that, I would like to touch upon the fact that it has been categorized as a hybrid threat, as a means of asymmetric attacks involving non-military means to destabilize and weaken political systems in general. So you can see already here that it is characterized as difficult to attribute, which is one point that I'd like to also mention later. Before going into certain methods and means by different actors, specifically focusing on Russian and Chinese disinformation campaigns that are being waged, also affecting the European Union and its member states, I would just like to point out a couple of recent examples, past examples, including disinformation campaigns that we have seen. So we have seen a rise in disinformation during the European elections in 2019, during the Yellow Vest movement in 2018 and 2019 during the Brexit referendum, and of course also during the US elections in 2016. Do you want to talk to Sulaiman for a moment? Because I think you're back now. Sorry that we have lost you.
I just wanted to let Sulaiman know that after Michael's presentation, we'll come back to you so you can finish what your wrap up.
Okay. So I also would like to point out at the beginning that disinformation is not necessarily conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories might be a method, might be included in disinformation, but disinformation is broader. So the intention of the aggressor is really at the center here. The intentional spread of misleading false information in order to cause disruptions, in order to cause harm. And disinformation is indeed no new phenomena. Alessandro has touched upon it already before a little bit, mentioning that it has already been a strategy by Russia in the past, but I would argue that it goes back even further in history, that even Sun Tzu has wrote about tactics of using misinformation, disinformation to disrupt, to confuse the opponent. So this is a very prominent tactic of simply misguiding an enemy, misguiding an entity by feeding them wrong information. So aside from spreading malicious and harmful information, I think that the campaigns also aim and lead simply to the fact in general that distrust is spread not even by confusing the population, by probably contradicting floods of information, but simply that the recipient, that the reader cannot differentiate anymore in general between the truth and lies. That it conveys a notion that impartiality, objectivity is generally impossible. So this is also a point of view that I'd like to consider here. So just simply touching a little bit on different layers of disinformation. So we have the aggressor, the creator, a state or a proxy, which is intentionally creating disinformation and trying to disseminate it. Then we have the spreading entity, that is a state-sponsored group of individuals, often also called troll farms or web brigards, professionals that are institutionalized, so groups that are spreading disinformation and that are funded by state entities in this current scenario. And then we have platforms, social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, etc. So different platforms that are being that are providing the digital space where then this information can be spread and can grow. And then I would argue we also have multipliers, so individuals that receive disinformation and that believe it and that spread this information without critically assessing it. So probably these multipliers don't have a malicious intention. They're affected by this information themselves and spread it. We have heard that, especially now within the COVID crisis, that people have just spread information, text messages, WhatsApp messages without critically assessing where they're from, without assessing their content, and just sending them to friends and families in order to warn them, not being aware that it actually contains information that is malicious. And then we have the recipient society, so individuals, institutions, organizations, companies who are overwhelmed by this information, who start to believe it, and who then also spread it again in their own networks, and therefore creating what the WHO has called an infodemic that has been spread across Europe, but also across the globe in this corona virus, in the COVID-19 virus. So I hope that we have a little bit of time later also to touch upon different examples. We have heard a couple by Martina as well, that different narratives that are being spread, how disinformation is being propagated. I have found a couple of interesting trends here also relating Russian disinformation during the corona, that it is being mixed with older narratives. So several disinformation that are allegedly from Russia have connected it to sources of other narratives, that COVID-19 is spread more by migrants, that it helps Greta Thunberg to promote her green agenda, that it is linked to homosexuality. So we can see here the trend that already loaded discourses, already loaded narratives, emotionally loaded narratives, are being abused and are being brought forward and included into the general COVID-19 disinformation campaigns. And due to that, we can also see certain trends of EU-related disinformation narratives, that the EU fails to cope with the virus, that the EU is selfish and only looks at its own and betrays its own values, that it lacks solidarity, and that the EU member states fail to cope with responding to crisis, that certain states are becoming more autocratic in the whole spread of the crisis, and that only Russian and Chinese sources and state actors are helping the EU and its member states. So we can see here this different deflecting motives and intentions to actually turn an agenda, turn a narrative in a certain way in order to align with some sort of the agenda that is being portrayed here.
Thank you very much for that. Let's go back to Sulaiman just to finish up his talk, and then we'll ask some questions. Thank you. Go ahead.
I actually don't know where exactly I left off. I don't know when I lose you.
We lost you when you said, let me start ending my introduction.
Yes, well, I talked about the two major campaigns, which is propaganda and also biowarfare, or biological warfare. As Ali Khamenei claimed, it's designed by the US. And to sum up, we said all those disinformation campaigns, and while the outbreak is going or spreading into the country, the regime did not lock down the city of Qom, which is the center of the pandemic. And also the regime did not actually suspend the flights from and to China, did not require any quarantine measures, and kept businesses, cities, borders open. Also encouraged public gatherings, either for political events or for religious or at religious shrines. And if I still have time, I could talk about also the reasons behind this delay. And as we said, like one of the major reasons is, at least for Khamenei and his hardliners, let's say, faction in the government, they cared about the turnout at the 40th anniversary of the revolution, which happened on the 11th of February. And they cared also at the turnout at the parliamentary elections, which happened on the 21st of February. And they did not want to affect the mindset of people, let's say, or have low participation. Second, the government, and I would say like the government, Hassan Rouhani and his faction, they tend to take this approach. They are actually prioritizing economic gains and revenues over the well-being of the nation. So they kept flights back and forth between China and Iran, even though they had known at that time that the pandemic is spreading in China. Also, the power given to clerics and how they obstruct the order of the government, and they intervene. Actually, they broke into some shrines when the government ordered those shrines to be closed. And third reason, let's say, the existence of over 700 Chinese students studying in Qom, and also 4,000 workers and technicians and engineers in petrochemical industry in Qom. And those workers and students have got used to go back and forth between Iran and China. And also, fourth, I would argue that the Mahan Air, which is owned by IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, has like kind of a pact or a treaty between Mahan Air and Air China to keep on the flights going, operational, and in some reports leaking about the monopolization of some medical equipment in Iran, and who leaked those reports claim that the IRGC is behind this. I can stop here now, Dr. Mitchell, and if there's some other aspects, we could discuss it during the discussion.
Thank you everybody for your contributions. This is, I think, quite a diverse panel and a lot of food for thought. I'm going to start by asking individual questions to the individual panelists, one by one. I'm starting, I'll follow the same order as the presentation. And then I will ask a general question to everybody. And then I'll open up to the questions of the audience, which I've already been trying to collect. So for the audience, if you have questions, by all means, send them to the Q&A section on the webpage, on the Zoom meeting here below. I'm already going to ask a question to Martina. The question will be echoing the question that Ricardo Mazzucchelli has asked as well. Which is, how do you correct all this? Because I think what's the most important, or one of the more important points that you raise is about the asymmetry of information, and the asymmetry of access to information and correct information. So how do you fix it? What's the how in all this? How do you get better information to more people?
So thank you for the question, and thank you also, Ricardo, for the question. I think that the key is to really convince those with the information and the decision makers to understand that they will benefit from being more open and from sharing information. That this will really serve their purpose in finding some buy-in. The way how CV works, we are a think tank, we are not an international organization, but we really work on demand, and we've registered much increased demand of different governments, many of them affected by decades of armed conflicts with very weak institutions, who are just basically desperate. They really don't know how to communicate, or they find it difficult to communicate with the general public in this climate, when we have new technologies, when information spread very fast, in areas when it's difficult to access water and basic sanitation and food. People still do have access to internet, and people have cell phones. So it's very easy for this information to spread. And in many parts of the world, we also see that these areas are really turf war for proxy wars. So we have many other actors who are interested in eroding trust in these governments. So what we do is we help the governments understand how they can benefit from being more open and trying to give them the tools for this. So for example, CV organizes different workshops for these affected governments, but we would never tell them what they should communicate. We just give them the tools and explain them that they would benefit with this. And I think this also goes to the question that it's a very difficult science has been getting a very bad publicity. We live in a climate, and that's really not only in conflict affected areas, but that's mainly in our part of the world, when people just say, I don't believe in science. We see it with the climate change. They dispute facts that are not really there to be disputed. Basic facts that are established, people would just say, no, I don't believe science. And this, of course, was supported by certain politicians with very good PR. So we really need, this is really one of the challenges. We need to help the scientific knowledge and the technical information become more interesting for the politicians and decision makers, who then have the political will, and then who then have the power to and leverage to start with some changes. And this is really critical. It's not only about the COVID-19, but this is really how do we address impacts of climate change, and how do we address growing water scarcity. So it's really not about what we communicate, but maybe how we communicate. Maybe that's why Greta Thunberg's movement was so popular, because the communication there was very simple. The messages, because the scientists in the past, and that also goes on to COVID-19, maybe it's too complex. It's too complex to reach general public. So we really need to rethink the way how we communicate in this. And then it's on us to help those who ask for it, help them with these communication strategies, but we just give them the tools, and then it's up to them how they use it.
Thank you very much. So Alessandro, I'm going to ask you a question about why disinformation, especially in a European context, hits such fertile ground. And this is going to be echoing one of the questions that Giuseppe Caros dear friend of mine, a dear friend of ours here in the center, is posing about, in essence, liberal democracies and conspiracy theories. They do have, there is something to be said about having an open press and therefore having, the ability of affecting people's thoughts on certain topics. But I'm wondering about why we have such an interest in information in Europe. Why does it have such fertile ground here?
Well, the first thing is there is press and press. You call it yellow press, you call it how you want. They publish rubbish. The problem is the public is accustomed, a large section of the public is accustomed to such rubbish. You can see talk show when you talk and there is no content, no sense, there is pure nonsense. And each theory is just, diffused as, this is my opinion. Well, very nice. Who cares? We want knowledge, not opinion. But this is so fascinating. People, spend hours and hours and hours, at least certain people, just to look at those opinions. And if people are celebrities, so the better. You understand, I don't make very much about opinions. It's a personal thing you can have at the bar with a drink. But, then when you have to be serious in information, then you must do your job as a journalist. Problem is, there is a good section of the press that doesn't check. Fact-checking, source-checking. So that's the first thing. The other thing is that, unfortunately, and this is a problem of political discourse, in many countries, you are not accountable for the lies you tell. Oh, it was just so. My country can be a very good example, at least we had a splendid example with Mr. Berlusconi, but we were just the forerunners. I see around many copies of that sort of phenomenon. Everyone has its own personal source, national source, how to do that. And we see that. Well, before it would have been very serious. Now it's, let him talk. And on this ground, it's easy to disinform. And the other thing is, I suspect, a lot of frustration. Part of it is really economic. The more people are confined at home, the less they work, the less gain. Well, rage and frustration are very bad advisors, but you tend to believe, you must really know what is the real secret behind all this. You must give a sense of that. Conspiracy theories are as old, as the world. During the pest, each plague we had in Europe, you had conspiracy theories. The people who purposely diffused the plague in cities, and they were killed or lynched. So that is old. But the other thing is, you are also sometimes disillusioned with a number of your partners. When you see smart countries like China or Russia, sending on time with great fanfare, much needed aid, no matter if it's, free or paid, that makes an impression. And when you have parties that say, well, okay, Russia's not so bad. Of course, Russia is not so bad. It's a European country since ages, but certain policies, well, sorry, they are a problem. And when you see that your big allies tell you, well, first of all, you get sanctions because I'm not competitive in your market. And then the alliance, well, that's obsolete. And well, the alliance you have to pay, like, if you go on a taxi. Well, these things resonate, even in a not so informed public opinion. And it's easily exploited, It's a mix, of, what our counterparts do, also to ourselves. And here we are, unfortunately. It's difficult then to pass information, good information. You have really it's a hard job, because on the one hand, truth is the best cure. It's really the best disinfectant. If you tell the truth, people check it and they see it's true. But you must exercise that sort of virtue. And then you have, at least specialized organs that try to dismantle fact checkers or whatever, these sort of fantastic stories.
Thank you. Yes, would you like to add something, Michael?
Yes, since celebrities have been mentioned, probably it's interesting to point out that there have been analyses that Chinese methods of spreading disinformation also go via celebrities and influential people on different social media channels. So they're offered money in exchange to propagate and to promote pro-Chinese information. So I found it quite interesting that you also mentioned celebrities here in this regard, because they can certainly be multipliers of disinformation and are being instrumentalized as such. Accountability, I totally agree with you. But before we have to speak about accountability, I think we also have to keep in mind that detection has to be improved. So as long as we cannot detect disinformation and disinformation campaigns and basically unfold them as such and inform and raise awareness that this has been a disinformation campaign or that we are under attack by certain forms of disinformation, we also cannot talk about accountability. So I think that the EU as a next step also has to increase and improve methods and means of detection, as has been done already in the past. We have seen that already through different mechanisms, through rapid alert systems, early warning systems, fact-checking as well. But certainly there has to be more efforts in just finding new methods of detecting certain disinformation campaigns. And the issue about free speech, I also completely agree. This is a very critical question that we probably cannot answer, because I think that democracies, liberal democracies, are faced with this really difficult task now to tackle disinformation on the one hand, but safeguard the freedom of speech at the other hand. And I don't see a contradiction. I see that it's possible to do both at the same time, but not as it is being currently done by Hungary, for example, not by this set of new laws that are very much trying to engage with disinformation, but that laws that also dictate and also tell that journalists might also be affected by it. So the state, what I want to say is that the state and the national entity cannot dictate what is information. Disinformation, it should be civil actors and civilians. And civil society organizations, international organizations should be in the lead here and not national entities.
Thank you very much. I'll turn to Sulaiman. I've got a question about, because actually it's all coming in together, and since you focus on Iran, and some of the questions have been about Iran, and I'll get to the audience's questions afterwards. But in the meantime, do Iranians believe Iran's disinformation? I mean, because here we're talking about two different things. On the EU level and within Europe, you have other groups that are trying to influence the information. It's not typically, although sometimes you have some governments using exaggeration or disinformation to a degree. But in Iran, it's clearly a regime putting out information or disinformation to its public. My question is, do Iranians believe the rhetoric coming out of the Iranian regime? Or as Martina pointed out before, do they believe that gargling rose water and vinegar is going to cure them of the disease? So I'm wondering to what extent the propaganda is effective there.
Well, I believe during a time of a pandemic, everyone is struggling, to find the true information. And I guess everyone is affected by that, every nation, not only Iranians. And Iranians during this time, they were looking for, for the official announcements to have the true information they are looking for. But instead, they saw something different. They saw some videos leaking about some, dead bodies piling up in some cemeteries and some satellite footage of, graves and etc. So this made them actually panic. I guess there's, to some extent, definitely people are not very stupid, they know exactly what they are following. And during Nowruz, for example, I guess there was less participation, because usually there are some occasions on the street, celebrating and putting some fires on and stuff like that. But during the late Nowruz on 22nd of March, there was actually much less. People stayed in home, even though the government did not require quarantine measures. Many people are staying home. Although, as I said, religiously, this is affecting the Iranian community, because people still think they are protected by God, and they can go to shrines to ask for recovery and health. And we have seen some videos of some pilgrims licking the plated fixtures, of some shrines in Qom. And this is absolutely, insane, I would say, because this is the way that this pandemic is spreading. And unfortunately, some rituals of the Shia Muslim, faction is all directed towards spreading the virus more.
Michael, here's a question, because we've mentioned China once, and China is perhaps one of the has produced one of the largest, most comprehensive campaigns in Europe that basically tries to change the narrative, to show themselves as coming to support the United Kingdom or coming to support Italy in its time of need, whereas the European countries or the United States are not, which we know is not true. And this is a way of rehabilitating their image. So maybe you can tell our audience a little bit about the Chinese approach to disinformation in this COVID-19 crisis, and what are the European responses, and what should the European responses be?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So I'd say that China is trying to play more the soft power card in framing and in setting the narrative and the agenda. China has tried to build up narratives where it says that only China is helping the European Union and its member states, while European institutions are failing to cope with the crisis, that China is showing way more solidarity, especially to countries of the Western Balkans, but also countries that are member states of the European Union, and that they are praising themselves and their leadership, that they're doing the best job they can do to contain the virus, that they lead by example, that sort of way, and that the West should actually be grateful for the quick Chinese response and reaction. So this is more or less the narrative that I have identified. And there are also some other conflicting information spreading, especially outside from China, that the virus doesn't actually originate from China, that it has originated from Italy or other parts, or that it was actually brought to Wuhan by US military personnel. But what we have to keep in mind is that the Chinese Great Firewall is preventing the Chinese population to use social media like Facebook and Twitter. So the audience that is being directed here is in particular the Chinese audience that is living abroad outside of China, but also the states and the populations from Europe and from other parts of the world. Whereas with Russian disinformation, we see that it has the layer of being directed towards the Russian domestic population and the international population. In regards to methods, I found it also quite interesting that there has been another analysis by ProPublica, an independent newsroom, that has revealed that China is also hijacking or faking Twitter accounts a lot. So there have been numbers of events and incidents where there has been the hacking of accounts, and therefore then the hijacking of accounts, so that hacked accounts are being transformed into platforms of spreading disinformation into multipliers of disinformation. So since August of 2019, this platform, ProPublica, has identified more than 10,000 suspected fake Twitter accounts that have been hijacked by affiliations, organizations with ties to the Chinese government. So here we have again the problem with accountability, that it is very, very difficult or almost impossible to have proven facts that Chinese or Russian or any other entities are behind some sort of disinformation campaigns, because we have entered an age that is called the globalization of disinformation, where we have incidents, and these are actual incidents, where Nigerian companies with Russian software, with content that is produced in the Philippines, are attacking European systems. So here you can see that this has so many international, local, and regional levels, so many different proxies and actors that are being involved. So again, here I would like to point out that tracing the source, the real manufacturer, the creator of disinformation is very, very difficult. And in my eyes, one very good method that the European Union has applied is the EU versus Disinfo platform, where since 2015, different disinformation has been recorded, has been categorized. I think over 7,000 incidents of disinformation are publicly available on that website. So from 2015 to today, you can see certain trends, you can see certain differences in how behaviors of certain actors have changed. And I think only through rigorously collecting, analyzing, categorizing sources and content of disinformation, we can probably also figure out ways to investigate future trends, to see how the trends have been changing, how the narrative has been changing, and therefore making links to certain actors.
Thank you very much, all of you. The questions, the answers that you provided have been, I think, even more food for thought than the first round. I will turn over now to the audience to get some of their feedback and questions. The first question, I will read it directly off of the script. So the first one is by actually the questions got upvoted, so or comments have been upvoted by the audience. So we'll address first Arthur de Lidekerke's question. So he's raising this point in question to the entire panel. He remarked that we've talked about the usual suspects, China, Russia, and Iran, but what about the rise of the rest? He says that we're seeing increasingly active and competent states or state-backed purveyors of disinformation. Some, like the Philippines or Azerbaijan, use it to stifle domestic opposition. Others, like Venezuela or Pakistan, to influence views outside of their borders. Who is on your watch list? Thank you, Arthur. Would somebody like to jump in? If you would, just maybe raise your hands. Go ahead.
Thanks God, modern communication is inherently democratic. Why should we exclude lesser actors? They do what they can do it. Now, it is evident that when you talk about the second or the third biggest power or the fourth, it is evident that you talk about the big ones. But surely, when you go into the regional environment, well, then you see that these people and these governments or these private entities follow exactly what they learn from, around the world. I consistently tell my Italian fellow politicians, don't think you speak in Italian, you speak for Italy only. The whole world is listening to you. Apparently, sometimes they don't get the message, but I see that also in other countries it happens exactly the same. And well, this gives additional ammunition to countries who want to play their game.
Would somebody else like that? Or go ahead, Michael. Go ahead.
Yes. So again, with regards to the European Union and its member states, which is my primary focus point here, we have to say that the majority of disinformation campaigns originates either in or through Russian sources or in or through Chinese sources. So it is of course important to point out different other actors, especially also in the globalized setting of disinformation. But several analyses have pointed out also the External Action Service's special report on disinformation on the coronavirus, which was just released last month, have pointed out that the most cases are coming from pro-Kremlin or pro-Chinese sources. Having said that, I've also investigated a little bit on how disinformation is spreading on the African continent, and we can also see that the narratives here are very troubling and very troublesome, especially also in regards to cures. Similar disinformation has been spreading that alcohol, that certain natural sources are curing the disease, which are, of course, not proven to be correct. We simply don't have this information yet. So we have to regard it as wrong from the current point of view. But there have also been other sources of disinformation that warmer or more humid climate will not transmit the virus, which is also wrong, as we can see in South American countries, especially in Ecuador at the moment, where the spread of the virus, especially in southern parts of the country, has been very dramatic. And there we have climates of 25 to 35 degrees and a high humidity as well. So certainly we have to also look at other actors and how other than the most common, most usual suspects are acting here in terms of spreading disinformation. But in terms of the European Union, its member states, Russia and China are the two actors that are most prominent here in spreading false information.
Thank you. So go ahead, Martina, go ahead.
I just would like to add that there is a 2019 study by Oxford University that found out that 70 countries, either government agency or political party in 17 countries has resorted to disinformation. So it's really not only the usual suspects, it's really anyone who has interest in controlling a certain narrative. And we also should not forget the non-state actors. Just think about ISIS, how effective they were in creating different disinformation videos. So it's really, we should not be limited only to the usual suspects, and it's all really tailor-made for certain regions. And also it's fueling different sentiments against countries. In Africa, there was also disinformation that there will be the vaccine tested on African population. Similar disinformation came also with regards to Ebola in the past. So it's really, we need to think who has the interest on using this very powerful tool against other actors.
Thank you very much. I would like first to, Sofia Barbarani does not have a question, but I think her statement needs to be reiterated. Sofia is writing that it's so refreshing, quote, "It's so refreshing to hear an Italian talk about the need to cut down on opinions and up the facts. Italian media is incredibly guilty of assuming people want to read a journalist's opinion. Thank you, Alessandro, exclamation mark." I will take the next two questions together. So Nicole Eli and Aaron Bosman, because they're both directed at Sulaiman. So Nicole Eli asks, quote, "I would like to ask Sulaiman if he thinks the way the government has handled the COVID-19 crisis will have an impact on the current political situation in Iran, considering the recent protests." And Aaron Bosman asks, in last week's webinar, it was mentioned that the COVID crisis and the response to it from the Iranian government could be the straw that breaks the camel's back. Do you agree this crisis might be the end of the regime? Please. You're on mute.
Can you repeat, please, the second question? I couldn't hear you.
Sure. The second question is, Because last week we discussed if this could be the straw that breaks the camel's back in the regime of Iran. And so the question is, do you agree that this crisis might mean the end of the regime?
Well, let me start with this question, the second one. I wouldn't say so, honestly, even though the regime as a whole, like the regime and also the government, because some people will draw some distinctions between those two things. But anyway, I wouldn't say it's going to be the end of the regime. Even though the US sanctions is really, deteriorating the economic revenues, and the government is suffering, I would say now. But in the short term, I wouldn't say so. And probably they will get some help from China, Russia, and elsewhere. Yeah, and the first question, the recent uprisings, recent revolutions, they affected the community, but you must know like the complexity of the regime itself and how it works and how they control. So there's the deep state which controls everything. They control the media, they control companies, they control different sectors of the economy. They control everything basically. And yeah, even though the reformers and reformists of the second faction in the government, whose Rouhani is accounted for, they are doing their best, especially after November 2019. But the government blocked them down, honestly, and killed many protesters. And here's the irony, actually, because during the protest of November 2019, there was many criticism against the government, while in recent occasions when, for example, there was some shrines, religious shrines closed, some people on the hardliners' side, they came in and they broke into those shrines, even though the police and the forces, the military forces were there, the IRGC, they let them in. They didn't, fight back those protesters. But on the contrary, during the revolution in 2019, there was a huge criticism and there was a huge fighting against the protesters. There was killing and many acts of the government. And yeah, this is like the irony here. And I think, I hope I answered the question right.
Thank you very much for that. As I said, so the questions that are being raised are then able to be voted up. And so if your question is not being answered right away, or if we run out of time, I do apologize ahead of time. But I will turn now to the top of our list, which is Margarita Montanari, who has a question for Michael. Quote, during the COVID-19 emergency, the European Commission President stressed the importance of controlling the spread of disinformation, urging tech giants to act against fake news and misinformation campaigns. Are digital platforms doing enough? Do you think that this crisis is proving the appropriateness of the EU strategy toward disinformation, or rather its weakness? Thank you for this question.
I think it's a very important question, very good question. The European Union has introduced a certain set of mechanisms already before the COVID-19 crisis. So within the last couple of years, certain platforms, certain mechanisms have been introduced. I have already mentioned the EU versus Disinfo, which is part of the EU East Stratcom task force established in 2015. There has already been also the EU Action Plan Against Disinformation put in place in late 2018. And the Code of Conduct, Code of Practice on Disinformation also put in place in 2018. And I think the question is also related to this Code of Practice on Disinformation. This was agreed between the European Union and different online platforms in 2018, and then I think put in force in 2019, that social media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, Google, Microsoft as well, joined with the EU to address disinformation. So I think this was the very first joint venture in that regard in the preparation for the European Parliament elections last year. So during that time, millions of fake accounts, harmful accounts have been detected, have been deleted by these platforms, and the EU has thus set some sort of standard, or is starting to set a standard that platforms are complying to. In regards to the question if these platforms are doing enough, I would say we have certainly seen that they're doing more than before. These platforms, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, have acted now very, very quickly in times of the COVID crisis to remove misinformation, to block accounts, and also to raise awareness. That is a quite interesting U-turn, because in the past, these companies have always said, well, it's technical issues, that they are limited by technical measures and technical facts, that they cannot act quickly. So we have seen that this has proven wrong, that they can act quickly if they want to, if they do not lack willingness. So it's good to have that as a general takeaway for the future as well, to hold platforms also accountable. But nevertheless, I think more action has to be taken, especially since Google continues to make revenue from advertisements that are promoting different sorts of false or misleading cures to coronavirus. Certainly these information are harmful, and companies and tech giants to have to be taken accountable, especially if they make money through running ads. So I think the European Union has to put more pressure on these platforms, on social media in general as well in the future, as we're continuing to tackle this information during the COVID crisis.
Great. I would like to pose a question that was raised by our very own Matthew Robinson, who's somehow situated in Northern Ireland. Well, he's from Northern Ireland, and sadly not with us here in Rome at the moment. So Matthew, this is a quote: "With the upcoming US presidential campaign in November likely to be fought on an unprecedented level online as opposed to conventional campaign methods, to what extent," oh, he just disappeared. Sorry, yeah, there. "To what extent should both the Trump and to a greater extent the Biden campaigns be concerned," it keeps moving, "be concerned about misinformation and interference by outside actors, as demonstrated in the 2016 US presidential election? The Clinton campaign was not nearly prepared enough to combat misinformation."
Okay. I think that not only the two contenders need to be concerned. Now, we are not at our first event, so we can't pretend to be innocent. They have to be very careful. They should both avoid language that allows manipulation. So inflammatory language or false claims are exactly what is not needed. And as an Italian, I've seen already, a lot of them, in my campaigns. So I'm not really surprised, but this is why I insist on that. But then I would add, since it is, an important election of an important country, every sensible government should be concerned. And media should, redouble attention, because it will be done. It's quite predictable, unless our, professional counterparts from other countries want to surprise us. Well, okay, interesting surprise. Otherwise, it's quite fair to think that the election see a lot of interference, and sometimes this interference will be helped from within or under the underhand requested from within, which is even worse. But as an Italian, I'm not terribly surprised, unfortunately. You know. Italians do it better.
Somebody else want to jump in on that, maybe? If not, we can move to the next question. I would like to address the question by Suzanne Schroeder from Moscon in Berlin. The question is, quote, is the vulnerability to disinformation and conspiracy theories about the need for emotional security, the desire to have a bias confirmed rather than contradicted, and how much does pop culture play a role in enhancing this vulnerability? So please, it's an open question and actually very interesting. I would love also to be able at some point to answer. But go ahead. Anybody? Martina?
I think it's really about people needing answers to some burning questions. And what we've seen actually in Europe, for example, with the migration crisis, is many of the difficult questions are just not being addressed by mainstream politicians. At least that's what we could see here in Sweden, that a lot of questions that the general public really wondered or wanted to know, if they were, it was difficult for the mainstream politicians to really give a very straightforward answer. And that really created a lot of space for these different disinformation campaigns. And then, of course, then people feel the need to really get a simple information from other sources, and then pop culture can play a huge role. And now when we think about the climate change and different recommendations, we get a lot of help from different celebrities in this regard, and also in the way how we can change our lifestyle. So I would see this is something good, but in general, it's really the wish of people to understand better the current challenges that are often just being ignored by the politicians, and that really creates space for other elements.
Go ahead, Michael. Go ahead.
I would also say that disinformation is feeding from uncertainty, or the notion of uncertainty in the general public. So whenever we have a situation, no matter if it is Brexit, the Yellow Vest movement, elections that are coming up, that is creating some sort of uncertainty in the general public, in the wider public, about the future. That we don't know how this is going to continue. Also with the COVID crisis, we don't know yet the implications of the crisis. The full scope of the consequences are yet to be determined. So first of all, in terms of uncertainty, I think we have to stay even more vigilant, and therefore we are even more vulnerable. And the vulnerability also comes from the dependency that we have created in our societies and our systems on the digital sphere, on this interconnectivity, on different online sources, on Zoom in times of these, to actually communicate across continents. So the dependency on different digital means, different digital media, is also at the same time creating this vulnerability and enhancing it. And I think we have to be aware of that.
So I think as we're wrapping up the session, and I would like to maybe raise my final, and I'll use the moderator's privilege to do so. There's one word that should, I think, let's say, be encouraged as a way of wrapping up today's session, which is the word trust. How do you trust the information that you're receiving? In the case, and like I said, Sulaiman has a very different angle, because actually what he's looking at is the disinformation coming out of a government. And so in this case, and it's not just in this, it's not just the situation in Iran. There are plenty of governments that are using disinformation as well for their populations. So I'm wondering, in that kind of environment where you're told on one hand to trust the official sources, but on the other hand, not to trust in times, how do we strike a trust balance, be it in Europe, be it in the Middle East, in relation to the information that we are confronted with every single day? So we can do our round robin. For this last goodbye, we'll start with who we ended with. So we'll start with Michael. Then we'll go to Sulaiman, then Alessandro, and Martina, you will end us off. So please, Michael.
I think it takes years, if not decades, to build trust, and it can then be destroyed in seconds. So it's very volatile, it's very fragile. We should be aware of that. And it's also an obligation to ourselves somehow to not be affected by disinformation. So I think that we can contribute to not be affected ourselves by disinformation, which is also at the same time building up our own trust. And therefore, I would like to probably just give the audience a small insight in what we can do ourselves to contribute to mitigate the spread from disinformation and mitigate being affected by it ourselves, to critically assess sources, authors, outlets, pictures, everything that you can see, and don't share what you don't know. Don't share what you can't verify, basically, yourself. Cross-reference, double-check sources, and also don't hesitate to report false or misleading, polarizing information that you find online to the different outlets. And share this knowledge, share this awareness also with friends and family. Educate yourself and be vigilant in these uncertain times.
Thank you. Sulaiman?
Yeah, as you said, in the case of Iran, it's very complicated, and because it's the government, and most actually news outlets and media agencies, they are actually controlled by the government. But as you said, and Michael mentioned, it's about individuals and how we search for information. So I guess even for Iranians themselves, they look at dissidents outlets, for example, or like some Western medias, and they can see like the differences. Sometimes you have some exaggerations from both sides, but they will come to, to the middle or the common ground anyway. And as Michael mentioned, it's about all of us. We have to, identify, verify the credible sources usually. And we should, make sure and think before we tweet, before we share some information. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Alessandro?
Thank you, Mitchell. This is a philosophical and therefore an intelligence question. I won't repeat what already my colleagues agree. I would add that sometimes don't take for granted that somebody who's lied will continue to lie. Each time you have to ask yourself why. I know trust can be destroyed in seconds, you are right. But again, have a fresh look at what people or sources tell you and see how it matches. It takes time, I know, it takes effort. And in our busy lives, despite, the confinement or that we are experiencing in many parts of the world, but this is indispensable. And the other thing is, when you see outlets that, thrive on nonsense, shut them out. Just a matter of the ecology of mind. You can't allow to be polluted systematically by nonsense producers. And it's a very vast category, but it helps really to get, again, that fresh look in order to understand that even a dictatorship can tell the truth. It depends. So it's not easy, but truth exists. And alt-truth is a very dangerous, recipe for being fooled then by oneself. So drinking the Kool-Aid, they are American friends.
Thank you very much. Martina?
Very interesting discussion. Thank you.
You're on.
I think it's better. Now it should be fine. I think, yes, we all have information bias within us, and we often tend to follow more the information that we want to believe, that we want to hear. And this is really, I think then it's really also a little bit responsibility of us in the research community to think about how do we share the facts? how do we make the facts and information and the unbiased information accessible to wider public? How do we really communicate with public? And this really goes as a call. There's been a lot of attempts in the climate and water community, but we need to continuously work on this. How do we get the information to the wider audience, and how do we really secure that people do listen to us? And I do agree fully that trust, it's a very fragile thing, very fragile commodity. And when we are building relations in difficult climate, it is the trust. It's we can spend, yes, many years building it, and then it can be really destroyed, as Michael said, within a second. So I think it's really to think how we can, as individuals in our professional capacity, contribute to this. But also I would like to say we should also remain optimistic and not to spiral in this rabbit hole and then bring this negativity with us.
Thank you very much, everyone. So first, I know that this is usually the time that we get to take out our business cards and say thank you and give it out to the audience. Sadly, we can't do that, but you know, I'm sure that using these same technologies, we'll be able to meet each other. And hopefully when this crisis is behind us, we can meet each other in person again. For the audience who are listening, if you have questions for the panelists, you can either directly contact them. I'm sure they'll be happy to respond to you, especially if we didn't manage to get to your questions today. If not, you can write to us and we will forward the questions to the panelists. And stay tuned. So next week we'll again have an event. We'll send you out the invitation. So we look forward to seeing you then. Next week's will be in partnership with Moscon in Berlin. So stay tuned for that. We're finalizing the program and we'll get it out as soon as possible. So thanks to everybody. Thank you for your contribution, and thanks to the audience for sticking with us. So I do a round of applause to everybody. You could hear the crowds everywhere are chanting your name. So thanks again, and we'll see you soon. So keep in touch.